Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Louise Morse. I am the Division Chair of STR, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual event on purposeful growth. This year at STR, we're running several events under the theme of impact and relevance. So please keep an eye on our STR homepage or social media for advertisements of the next events. I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting conversation today, so thank you very much to the panelists for being here. And thank you very much to Koen Heimerichs for organizing this session. I'm going to hand over to Koen to introduce the event of today and also the speakers.
Thank you very much, Louise. It's a great pleasure to organize this session jointly with you for STR. Very excited to have this wonderful panel today. My name is Koen Heimerichs, as Louise said, from Wharton Business School, and having today a great set of speakers for our virtual symposium on purposeful growth. Excited to announce this wonderful set of speakers with Alan Morrison from Oxford, Claudine Gartenberg from Wharton, Flore Bridoux from Erasmus University, and Ranjay Gulati from Harvard. As said, great set of thought leaders on the topic of purpose and growth and purposeful growth. I guess, a very timely topic when it comes to some of the key developments in our field of study, and really excited that we can, debate some of the leading thoughts on this very topic. I'm not going to keep you from listening to our great set of speakers. So if I may suggest, I'd like to go in order of sequence here with Alan kicking off. The setup is such that we allow our speakers to introduce and share their thoughts during presentations of about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we will open up the floor. Please feel free to use chat box for any questions that you may have. Meanwhile, we welcome those very much. We will take questions after the presentations have finished to open up for Q&A. That is the suggested setup. So once again, thank you for joining in, and may I invite Alan to share some of his thoughts on today's topic.
Thank you, Koen. I'll share my slides. So I was thinking about what to say about this topic, and I realized my contribution usually, and including on this occasion, is typically to say something about concepts. And the more I think about purposeful growth, the more I think it's actually quite hard meaningfully to talk about purposeful growth until we understand exactly what every single word in that phrase means. And as I cogitated over this, the work I've done on purpose is conceptual, and I want to try and extend my prior thinking on this by saying a little bit about how purpose of organizations, purpose of an organization, and purposeful organizations might be related. And hopefully that will open up some possible ways of thinking about this and of categorizing organizations and doing some quantitative research that actually has some content. So the concerns I have when I think about organizational purpose are fourfold, really. If I want to talk about organizational purpose, it's not even clear a priori what we mean by that phrase. So we might mean the purpose of organizations in general. Why do organizations exist? We might point at a particular organization and say, why does this organization exist? And even when we do that, it's not clear to me that at this stage we've identified a purposeful organization. I think we use this as a term of art to refer to organizations that have a particular property that we like or that we think might be a good thing. And I'm not sure that an organization that has a purpose is necessarily, therefore, a purposeful organization. So I'm simply going to try and be a bit more precise about what these terms might mean. I'm going to draw in my discussion of what the purpose of organizations in general is on two pieces I published with my co-author Rita Mota in AMR, that my thinking about the other questions is speculative. I've got some ongoing work on consciousness and corporations, which I think might help us to think about these things and which inform my discussion today. So I'm going to start by talking about what the purpose of organizations in general is. And the reason I've got all these pictures of brains is that I think of organizations using ideas that come from the theory of mind, from the philosophy of mind. And I'm going to use the phrase corporate mind. So organizations, I'm going to claim, are things that sustain corporate minds. And by corporate mind, I mean something technical. I'm referring to a set of intentional states that people who work for the organization recognize as good reasons to act. So they guide their thinking when they act on behalf of the organization. And I'm aware this might be confusing because the phrase intentional states is itself a term of art. It doesn't mean having intentions necessarily. It refers to a particular property of the way that we think. And it comes from a long line of thinkers. Brentano started thinking about this in the context of 19th century psychology. It made its way into phenomenology via Husserl and Sartre. And in the latter part of the 20th century, John Searle used the notion of an intentional state to ground institutional theory. And that's what John Searle's notion of intentional state is the one that I'm going to claim underpins the corporate mind. And I'm going to claim that's what organizations do when they're operating effectively. So an intentional state you can think of as being a picture of the world and an attitude towards it. Some people like Quine call them propositional attitudes. So here are some intentional states. I believe that the world is getting hotter. I believe that Leeds is warmer than Oslo. I'm pretty sure I know that cricket is better than baseball. Perhaps an organization has an intentional state that it intends a new road is built by 2029. Maybe I want to be more courageous. Maybe I intend that women be empowered, and I intend to buy 2 tons of concrete. Now, I don't clearly intend to buy 2 tons of concrete, but that's the sort of intentional state that an organization might form. An organization could form many of these states. It's unlikely organizations would find it useful to have intentional states about cricket or courageousness, although they may. But the other things seem to be things that you might view as good reasons to act on behalf of an organization if they were wired into the organization. So I'm going to claim that organizations sustain those things. So I think you can see that happening when you look at real life organizations. So here's the Body Shop, and which is for those of you who don't know about it, it's a British cosmetics firm. It uses environmentally friendly products. It cares about the environment, and it's very concerned to step away from traditional attitudes towards the shape of bodies and towards self-esteem and that sort of thing that sometimes obtain in the beauty industry. So they describe themselves as a feminine brand. They empower women and girls. They care about self-love. And I actually think all this stuff is true. The people I've met who work for Body Shop view these as good reasons to act. So you can extract intentional states from there. So if I want to understand what the purpose of this organization is, it must be embedded in the intentional states that drive the choices that its people make. So they have a list like this, but it's Body Shop related. And the list like this tells them how to act. And if there is something missing from the list and they find themselves needing to act, then the list needs to be extended, because otherwise the organization doesn't really have an attitude about how one should act. So I think the purpose of organizations perhaps is something that we extract from intentional states rather than design up front. It's something that we might even discover. That, I don't think, tells me yet what a purposeful organization is. So I spent yesterday afternoon trying to come up with a sensible way to explain why I think the Body Shop, I can identify purpose in Body Shop when I look at its website and I read Body Shop statements and I talk to Body Shop people about what they think is important from a Body Shop perspective. But I could say the same thing of organizations that I don't view as particularly purposeful. An organization that was just engaged in cobalt mining might say its purpose is to extract cobalt. So it has an intentional state that says we need to get cobalt out, another intentional state that says it's okay to employ children, and another one that says we're not going to worry too much about environmental standards. Those would be intentional states that the organization could sustain, but it wouldn't feel to me like a purposeful organization. So I want to try and understand what it is that makes Body Shop purposeful. And I think maybe it's because when I'm operating on behalf of Body Shop and I think about the Body Shop intentional states, I could imagine a conversation like this. So I became interested in Body Shop after I did some exec ed for someone who's on the board of Body Shop quite a long time ago. And I think if I said to them, look, I want you to think on behalf of the Body Shop, not on behalf of yourself, trying to understand the intentional states that comprise the Body Shop. Here are some questions. When you think for the Body Shop, what do you think about equality in the workplace? What do you think about deforestation of the Amazonian rainforest? What do you think about body shaming? What sort of things do you want to accomplish in the world? And I think people who work for the Body Shop and people who even just watch the Body Shop could probably answer those questions. And my candidate definition for what a purposeful organization is one that has a corporate mind, a collection of intentional states that address social questions like this. That doesn't necessarily, I think, actually have to be good. So you can imagine intentional states that were quite appalling, but they wouldn't just be about the things that people traditionally imagine that MBA students are concerned with. So a corporate mind that only refer to things like profit and market share and margins, entirely plausible, I suppose, or maybe not plausible, but something that Friedman imagines, at least a caricature of Friedman imagines that corporations only care about. If we can think of an organization as having intentional states, well understood by everybody, and it has reasons to act that answer a range of social questions, then I think we probably have a purposeful organization. I'm still not sure what purposeful growth means. Of course, I could say something cheap, like a purposeful organization is doing purposeful growth when it grows. But growth might mean the bottom line. It might be number of outlets. It might mean turnover. I presume it ought to mean growing in some metric that is contained within the corporate mind, which is one of the things it cares about. And I wonder if the right way to measure growth for a purposeful organization isn't just to think about turnover, it's to think about those things that are embedded in the corporate mind. And that seems to me a hard thing to do. Okay, I'm running out of time. I wanted just to conclude my 10 minutes by raising some open questions that I think are sort of interesting to think about. One is whether this is empirically useful. So I reckon I could go inside the most appalling organization and ask it these questions, and it's quite possible that people inside the organization would tell me what they thought I wanted to hear. But I suspect that some organizations generally have intentional states the sort I'm describing and others don't. And I think it might be possible to implement this way of thinking about organizations as a foundation for trying to understand how purposefulness, as I've defined it, relates to other metrics of performance. The second thing, which derives from my attempts to understand how consciousness and identity relate to this stuff, is whether purpose in this sense is guiding strategy or the other way around. So I'll mention this briefly because I'm going to run out, I'm going for my full 12 minutes. It's possible that you have a purpose that tells you what to do. And I've said intentional states give me reasons to act. So that definitely happens. I think it's also perfectly possible that I start doing things, and from those doings, intentional states emerge. This is essentially how Jean-Paul Sartre understands consciousness. It's possible that because I'm doing stuff, values emerge in the world, those values become intentional states, and then they become future reasons to act. And I think the sort of relationship between purpose as a driver of strategy and strategy as a driver of intentional states is an interesting subject for investigation. And I think something similar happens at the individual level. There's a sort of standard statement in the purpose literature that people join organizations whose purpose accords with their own. I'm sure they do, but I also think that people join organizations and are changed by them. And I think it's sort of interesting to ask whether the things that we do because organizations encourage us to do them alter our world outlook. And this again is an idea that comes from the phenomenologists who underpin the arguments I was talking about earlier, whether those things might actually generate personal purpose. So there are two feedback loops here. One is from strategy to purpose of organization. One is from individual to organizational purpose. And the relationship between these feedback loops seems to be complex and possibly interesting. Okay, 11 minutes. I've finished bang on time. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Alan, for a wonderful kickoff to the topic of today. Really interesting to see those thoughts around both the notions of purpose as well as growth. I'm very inspired by by numerous things that you mentioned. I won't dive into that in depth, but I think also the connection between how you look at sort of the corporate mind and also personal purpose is very interesting, and opens up a range of questions. Thanks so much for doing that. Can I invite Claudine to move to our second speaker? Thanks once again, Alan.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Okay,
Yep.
Great. Alan, that was so wonderful. I wish we were in person because I would love to talk to you more about these wonderful ideas. I've thought a lot about purpose more from a sociological tradition and a little bit of a psychological tradition, and never really from the philosophical roots of it. And so I think these these ideas are really, really interesting and intriguing. I'm going to bring us to a much more prosaic level and think about what do we know empirically about purpose, and how can we think about this link between theoretical ideas on purpose and empirical patterns that we see among companies, and how that link can help us make sense of what's going on. So let me share my slides. And everybody can I just see a quick thumbs up? Everybody can see those. Okay, fantastic. So I have been doing empirical research on purpose for the last decade or so, and trying to understand, what do we notice about how companies that appear to be purpose-driven, at least through some measures of purpose-driven, how can we see them behaving and competing differently in the market? So I'm going to start with, again, some definitions, but these are a little bit more prosaic than what we just heard, just so that we're on the same page on how we've been thinking about it in terms of this research. So when I've been studying purpose, I think about it as the idea of the meaning of a firm's work beyond quantitative measures of financial performance. So if the company disappears tomorrow, what would be lost from the world, more of the why. And so when CEOs talk about their purpose, that's the sense that we're trying to capture in our empirical research. And that differs from these other very important and interconnected topics of academic research that as I mentioned, are linked but not precisely the same thing. So that's when I mention purpose, that's how I've been thinking about it for the last decade or so. So purpose has been increasingly part of the conversation and is only growing. I think when we first started this research, when we looked at word counts, we had seen that it had gone up something like 2.5-fold over the past 2 decades, and it's only going up from here. So it's increasingly part of the conversation, both among practitioners and academics. However, there is a problem around this, which is that managers know this. And so there's a big cheap talk problem in this field, which is that, if everybody talks about it, then sort of in some sense, what does it actually mean over time? And my favorite version of this is a little bit overused at this point, but I still love it so much. You think of sort of the classic WeWork, the first instantiation of WeWork, when they talked about what their purpose is. It's just a word salad of meaningless words that come together. We're a community company committed to maximum global impact. Our mission is to elevate the world's consciousness. At some point, this language just ceases to be meaningful at all. And in fact, when I poll my MBAs, when we go through discussions of purpose, and I ask them, on the x-axis, in my own view, the idea of companies having a purpose is either important. On the, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but on the right is important, on the left is mostly fluff. And then the y-axis is their own experience of whether purpose has been motivating or empty in the workplace. Every year I get the same scatter plot of experiences. People both think it's meaningful and meaningless, and they have and have not experienced this in the workplace. So there's a sense that there's something out there, but then a lot of it is empty. And so what can we understand from this idea? So to try to address the empirical side of the equation on this topic, I've been engaged in a set of studies, and then I have some ongoing projects as well, on both trying to establish a measure of purpose. It's not the last word on purpose. It's not a perfect measure of purpose, but it's a way of potentially capturing the sense of whether organizations are purpose-driven or not, and then saying, what can we say with that measure? What can we learn about that measure? And so I'll talk about 3 of these papers today, and the big lessons that we've learned from these. So firstly, let's just quickly talk about how we go about, how do you measure this idea of purpose, if it can be so empty and so meaningful at the same time. And so how we don't measure it, let's start with how we don't measure it. So what we don't do is rely on either corporate purpose statements. So, some of you may recognize one of them or both of them. And what we say is they're very hard to tease apart. What's meaningful about these purpose statements are the conversations that go into creating them in the background, but not necessarily even the output themselves. And every company has one. So we don't rely on purpose statements. We don't rely on CEO language or public filings because it's very crafted. So instead, what we do is we measure not the what of purpose, but the strength of purpose. And we essentially say if employees on average believe that their work is meaningful on aggregate, then there's something that that organization is doing to establish a sense of purpose. So essentially what we do is we measure the aggregate sense of meaningfulness that employees feel in their job and we aggregate that up to the company level. And we measure variation at the employee level in order to infer variation at the purpose level. So we say we can't measure purpose directly, but it should manifest as employees on average feeling like their jobs have meaning and impact. So it's sort of the Bob Marley view of purpose, which is that employees are the most informed and possibly the least gameable of stakeholders. So you can fool them a little bit, but you can't necessarily fool them systematically over a long period of time. So that's how we get at our measurement. And then in terms of the insights that we've gotten from these measures, let me talk about some of the key takeaways from each of these, from each of the studies that we've done using that measurement approach. So the first study that we did, which sort of went through excruciating pains to establish that this was in fact a decent measure and that we could disentangle it from some of the other measures of that are associated that co-vary with it. What we did first is we attempted to say, how is this linked to financial performance? So that was our first study. And so what this study did is it used data from about 500,000 employees and 500 public companies. These are all US companies. Our data is all US based data. And so we took about 500,000 employees across 500 companies and we aggregated up to the firm year level the sense of meaningfulness that these employees feel. So the first finding that we find is that when you do that, not surprisingly, the sense of purpose falls down the organization. So the executives and the senior managers have the strongest sense, followed by those in sales and the middle management, and then all the way the people with the least sense of purpose are the hourly workers. So that was the first finding that we had from doing this. The second finding that we have is that purpose, this bundle of beliefs does not vary on its own. It's actually co-varies with two other bundles of beliefs when you run a factor analysis on this survey. And it's critical to run this factor analysis because there's so much latent, you have to orthogonalize these beliefs. You can't just sort of take an aggregate measure of purpose because it varies with overall satisfaction and engagement and all kinds of other stuff. So you have to run a factor analysis to get orthogonal beliefs. And what you find is that when you run this factor analysis, you actually get two flavors of purpose that actually map to sort of some 19th century sociology on where people find meaning in the world. So the first flavor of purpose is what we call purpose camaraderie, which is that you feel that your job has meaning and you feel like you have a sense of family at work. And then the second type of purpose is that you feel like your job has meaning and you feel like you have the tools and the employee and management has a clarity of where the organization is going. And critically, because this is a factor analysis, you orthogonalize the other types of beliefs. So this is not satisfaction. This is not trust in management. That's a completely different factor. So if you believe management is good, that's captured in a different factor. And so these are really distinct bundles of purpose that some companies are high in purpose camaraderie or low, and some companies are high in purpose clarity or low. And so those are distinct measures. And what we find is that whether you feel strong or weak purpose has no relationship to financial performance. Whether you have strong or weak purpose camaraderie does not relate to financial performance. But whether you have a strong sense of purpose clarity does. That strongly predicts future financial performance. And so just to give you a sense of what the punchline of this analysis is, if you imagine the x-axis here is sort of low purpose, high purpose, and the y-axis is a variety of measures of performance. This is just one, which is future profitability. Purpose camaraderie is not at all predictive, but purpose clarity is. The higher the purpose clarity, the higher the future return on the higher future profitability. And that's true for profitability. It's true for growth rate. It's true for stock returns, all controlling for where the company is now. It predicts higher performance. And the interesting thing about this result is that it's entirely driven by the middle layers of the organization. So when the executives feel this, there's no relationship to performance. When the hourly workers feel this, there's no relationship to performance. But when the middle layer feels this, there is. And we interpret this as sort of this relational, employee sort of relational contract that you have, where you can't incentivize this middle layer, but they form a really important glue and information within the organizations. And when they feel that the organization is doing meaningful work, then you see a higher performance. So I'm running short of time. So let me just zip through some of the other big takeaways from this research. We look at where variation in purpose comes from. And so we start with the principles of the organization. Who are the owners of this organization? And what we find, well, the first punchline, I don't have the slide in here, is that purpose is much stronger in private firms than publicly traded firms. In publicly traded firms, you see a drop-off in purpose, particularly in lower ranks of organizations. And we explain this by looking at the degree of dedicated owners. So I won't explain these two slides because I am running short on time, these two graphs, but essentially the shorter your time horizon of your owners, the weaker the purpose is within the organization. And so that's one of the punchlines from this paper, and that we can explain this by actual ways that these companies are managed differently. There's more outsider CEOs that come from more financial backgrounds. They engage more in inorganic growth. They have very different compensation structures. They're incentivized on margin metrics and cost metrics. And again, this is very intertwined, right? It's very sort of correlational. But in this paper, we go through pains to try to show that there's a little bit of there appears to be in part a treatment effect in this, not just a sorting effect. And I want to run to the last punchline in my last minute and a half. And this harkens back to our first paper where we say, look, there's a positive relationship between purpose and performance, but that's not true forever and always. That's not true in every setting. So this kind of gets to the theme of today's session, which is purposeful growth. It actually depends. And so what we find is that this positive relationship between purpose and performance is positive in some industries. In other industries, it's not. So it's positive in healthcare. The higher the purpose, the higher the performance. But in other industries like financial services, the higher the purpose, actually you see lower performance on average, not for every company, but at least that's the patterns. And so here you can see the different industries that are out there. Everything below the line means that they go separate, they're in opposition. So in oil and gas, chemicals, and finance, purpose and profits appear to be substitutes. And then in other industries, they appear to be complements. So how do we explain this? We basically show in industries which have very high R&D intensity, that's where purpose and profits go together. And we also show that in companies with high owner commitment, purpose and profits go together. So this bundle of intangible assets, long-term dedicated owners, and purpose appears to be a channel by which companies can realize better performance. And then in other contexts, short-term owners, low R&D, low purpose, you can actually also perform decently well in markets. So in closing, at least our data with our measure, companies can we find that companies can pursue both purpose and profits, but it has to be believed by the middle ranks of the organization. It's not something that CEOs can just proclaim and then it exists. Governance matters. So did the dedication of owners matter? And it's not true in every context. So when we talk about sort of, is purpose the pathway to nirvana in terms of superior profitability, maybe in some cases, but certainly not universally true, at least in terms of what our data shows. So that is all that I have, and I will stop sharing now.
Great, thank you very much, Claudine. Wonderful contributions here to take forth also what Alan initiated, and thank you for sharing the many different and interesting insights that you've been publishing over the years. And I think this brings a great sort of empirical side to the story that we are developing here together. And so thanks so much. Very, very interesting thoughts also around ownership and other questions that implicate in the different levels of managers as they contribute to creating value from purpose. I think that's very, very interesting, raising lots of questions too. Can I, with further ado, invite Flore to join in and offer your keynote, please?
Yeah, with pleasure. So here I hope you see that. Yeah, so I'm coming from a slightly different angle because contrary to Alan and Claudine and Ranjay, I haven't done work really on purpose. I do stakeholder theory, and what I would like to share about today is how the stakeholder theory, because I see a lot of work that try to link purpose and stakeholder theory. What do I think is interesting in stakeholder theory that can feed the conversation on purpose? But also maybe, as Claudine was already mentioning, she didn't explain why she sees a difference between stakeholder orientation and purpose, but I will give you my version, but there is a difference. And then I will go to some open questions, mostly maybe my open questions that make me interested. And I want to pursue some work on purpose, but there is nothing yet published. So what can we learn from stakeholder theory and then the state of affairs there? Well, stakeholder theory has talked about stakeholder orientation, so no purpose as such. But the big argument there has been that the stakeholder orientation creates in general more value for stakeholders, including shareholders, than a shareholder orientation or profit orientation. Depends a little bit on the author you look at, what the comparison point is. Literature hasn't been super clear about stakeholder orientation, but there's a general idea that it's about achieving balance, achieving fairness in relationship with stakeholders. It's in fact mostly tested on financial performance, things like profits, stock market prices, but the theoretical idea nowadays is that this value creation for stakeholders is much broader than only material outcomes, money. So, for instance, we're talking about meaningfulness for employees, directly related to what Claudine was saying. But it could be a sense of belonging, both for employees and consumers, for instance. Could be prosperity for local community through employment. So theoretically, at least, the concept of value is understood very broadly. The problem is in the measurement, to be honest. Making a step from this broad conceptualization of value creation to measuring it explains that we are still stuck with mostly financial measures. And the relationship that is listed above is, in general, we would expect a positive relationship, but the literature has also acknowledged plenty of boundary conditions, circumstances under which a stakeholder orientation will not create more value than a shareholder profit orientation. And I think that's also an interesting thing that can directly relate to what Claudine was saying, that there is no absolute, this is not kind of the solution or to all problems. So what is interesting maybe in stakeholder theory that I haven't seen maybe as much in the literature on purpose yet is how does that work? So the idea is quite simple. In fact, stakeholders get various benefits from a stakeholder orientation. And if you look at the literature in front and combine and put together everything that has been said about these benefits, you can build on these ideas from organizational behavior and justice that have been identifying 3 types of benefits. They're obviously material benefits. The idea is that, for instance, by working for a firm that is stakeholder oriented, maybe you get a higher wage. So it's really an economic benefit from working for a stakeholder versus a shareholder oriented firm. It also, and that's a thing that we don't take into consideration very often, but working for a stakeholder oriented firm, if it's fair, reduces uncertainty about future outcomes for yourself. If you know it's usually fair in its relationship, or usually it's often fair, it's usually fair the relationship with stakeholders, then you would expect that in the future, when renegotiation of your contract will come up and promotion will come up, you will be treated fairly, so it reduces uncertainty. And the second type of benefits that stakeholders can get from a stakeholder orientation are relational benefits. Think about yourself working for Patagonia. Yeah, okay, it has a very nice image, so you feel better about yourself and you feel more status. But then the interesting addition in more recent work and justice literature is all what's related to morality. That by working, buying, investing in a stakeholder-oriented firm, you have some moral benefits. Your need for morality can be also met. And that leads indeed, I mean, we show in an empirical paper, it's about CSR, but we show that this path exists in addition to the others. So in exchange of these benefits, then stakeholders are willing to work, to join, to stay, and to exhibit more organizational behavior, buy more, work harder for the firm, which creates value. So that's kind of going back to this higher level, firm level, how do you can value create it? In addition, if you think about the literature on reputation, stakeholders can talk positively about the organization, which creates this positive reputation. So that is stakeholder theory. I think this is a lot of ideas we can use in the discussion about purpose, that we don't need to redevelop in this discussion. But stakeholder orientation is, in my mind at least, different from purpose. And it brings very interesting questions. Because if you think about, okay, a purpose explains what value organizations want to create for stakeholders, then it means that purpose, in fact, contains a form of prioritization of issues or stakeholders. It tells what issues it wants to address. If you tell what issues you want to address, you also say which one you don't find as important. So in that sense, contrary to stakeholder theory, that is a little bit in my mind stuck sometimes with the idea we don't want at all to talk about trade-offs, we want to stay away from that. The discussion on purpose is very much a discussion where there are choices, and these choices have consequences. And my idea now is that, yeah, when you make choices and you have a strong purpose, and you communicate it very strongly, it will be very difficult to please all stakeholders. Some stakeholders will see a fit with their own values, but some stakeholders will not. I mean, the stronger your purpose, the clearer it is, and then maybe the more they feel that there is a misfit. So that means that purpose will bring in some self-selection dynamics. Some will leave. It's not me. It's not the right place for me here. There are also, if you think about maintaining your purpose, some selection dynamics that are necessary. Because, I mean, if you welcome all stakeholders out there, all type of employees, all type of customers, you probably will also have associated with stakeholders who want something very different, and there is a risk to maintaining your purpose if they value all type of. So it brings interesting ideas about that are very different from what stakeholder theory with a stakeholder orientation would allow us to think about. For me, there are a number of open questions, and maybe some of them, I mean, I'm sure Alan, Ranjay, and Claudine have really thought much longer about them, so it's kind of, okay, they have answers, but at least I'm getting into this, and I still have a lot of questions. So including about simply the definition of purpose. Well, I mean, there is this debate about, is it simply an organizational objective? I think we agreed it's not simply an organizational objective. It needs to go beyond profit maximization. But then I have been doing some work with one of my PhD students, Mirai Yoon, and as we were looking at, in fact, including there, we are using speeches. So, I mean, Claudine would not like that, but we were using speeches at the beginning of the shareholder meetings to try to see what are top management saying about the goals of the organizations. And then we see a lot of self-centered goals that are not profit. We see growth, we see innovation, and these goals could be quite attractive for some stakeholders, especially the ones who are very attracted by achievement-oriented goals. So the idea that profit will never motivate stakeholders, and not other things that are pro-social would always motivate them. There is something in between there that could be interesting. Also, when we were thinking about then the pro-social or the other oriented goals, the moral part, they seem to be two different things in the literature. Some people say, let's reduce the scope to stakeholders. And others who are saying, no, we need to take society, social goals, environmental goals, so natural environment. Well, stakeholder theory makes a clear distinction between the two. I mean, so going for a social goal or a goal related to natural environment that is going beyond stakeholders, in fact. And but that means that there could be some tension between the two. And then I was also thinking about, because that helps me at least thinking about empirically, what are we going to measure, and maybe then pushes the theorizing that what is the opposite of having a purpose or being purposeful? Is it being profit-oriented? Well, that's maybe one option, and that's what the definition of above would suggest. But it could also be having too many goals, and so having the attention dispersed, for instance, or not having clear goals. And what is interesting, I think, that if you each of these ideas about what is law purpose would lead to different mechanisms about how purpose creates value. Because as I was saying, the first one is like, okay, it would create less value because it's selfish, profit-oriented, that's selfish, we react to that, stakeholders react to that. But the second one could be a question of attention. If you have too many goals, attention is divided, and you perform less well. Or coordination, sorry, I mean, we cannot coordinate very well if we have multiple goals. So it's completely different mechanism that would suggest, support the relationship between purpose and value creation. Another thing that I was wondering about is how much buy-in do we really need from stakeholders to be purposeful and to create value from that purpose? Clearly, we need buy-in from employees. I mean, I think the literature is quite clear that if the simply stating is not purpose. I mean, it needs to be implemented in policies and practices. So you need employees. You probably also need investors buying into your purpose. Otherwise, they will constrain management, and in case of trade-offs, will force management to do other things than following the purpose. But what about other stakeholders? Do we really need customers to buy into the purpose? Yes, if you want to differentiate based on your purpose. But if you think that it's going to create, I mean, a lot of misfit with some customers, maybe in fact you don't really want to advertise your purpose very broad. I think that is just an interesting question, that when we think that purpose is always good, there is also that other side of misfit, and sometimes you might just want to communicate your purpose to some stakeholders and not too much to others. And finally, to finish, because I also was, when Kuna asked me purposeful growth, I was like, oh, for me, that's not that easy, this combination. Because growth is a goal, and then should it be the goal? I mean, I was a bit, Kuna, can I join if I'm really elitist with this? And the main point is that, in fact, I see a lot of tensions between purposes that incorporate preservation of the natural environment and serving society at large, and the definitions of growth I can see. Clearly, if you have a very narrow definition of growth as only economic value for shareholders, there will be plenty of moments where it's difficult to find the two. But also, even in material outcomes for stakeholders more generally, again, a lot of moments where if you want to give more value for more material outcomes to your stakeholders, such as employees or customers, you will have to use more natural resources. So protection of the environment is going to be more difficult. But I would say, okay, then that the solution is just to see value very broadly as economic, but also non-economic. And there, I mean, maybe to create some form of non-economic value, you don't need to rely on natural resources. Maybe well-being you can increase without depleting natural resources. I don't know. I mean, I haven't thought that through fully, but maybe there are ways. But at least if you still focus on benefits for stakeholders, you still have that tension between not everybody in society and the natural environment is often not seen as a stakeholder. So you could still have negative externalities from growing your benefits for stakeholders, even non-economic ones, and a purpose that is formulated even more broad as societal or. So thanks a lot, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Flore, for your wonderful contribution here. raising different questions as just to float a few. I mean, very inspiring. I think also to bring in the notions that you're sharing. And I think one of the questions that pops into my mind is, how do stakeholders inform the formulation of purpose in organizations? But equally, what is the consequence of having a clearly defined purpose, and how does value creation actually differ across different stakeholders, right? Because I think some of your, the issues that you raise here also, translate into some of those questions, and I think that's very, very interesting. Thank you very much for sharing that, and I'm sure there's lots of other interesting questions and notions to take forth from your presentation. Beyond that, can I invite Ranjay to as our fourth keynote here to share your thoughts on today's topic, please?
Sure. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to have a chance to join all of you and talk about my research on the subject. I have to confess, I was a late arrival to this party in terms of studying purpose. This is not a topic of my research. I actually was studying growth. That's what I study. And purpose was really not on my mind or on my radar. In fact, if you told me like 6-7 years ago, Ranjay, I have a crystal ball, you're going to write a book about purpose, I would have said, you're crazy. Not a chance. I mean, this is not what I do. What I was studying was, how do you study unlocking growth? I was studying organic growth and inorganic growth. I had looked at silos in organizations and org design. I had looked at customer centricity. I had looked at alliances and networks. And so that's what I studied. And my rough framework in my head was, businesses are about strategy and strategy implementation. That's what they do. And I was actually teaching a course at HBS on turnarounds and transformations. And for this course, I interviewed Satya Nadella. And, great story. I'd read his book. And I was asking Satya, I said, Satya, what a great story. What have you done? And I had worked at Microsoft early in my career. So, I was like, tell me more about what you've done. And he said, oh, it is all about building a strategy and implementing a strategy. And so I said, Satya, that's great textbook. That's how we teach it. So tell me more. And he said, no, you cut me off. You didn't let me finish. There's a third pillar to the story, which is around having a purpose. And without a purpose, we couldn't have unlocked our strategy or implemented our strategy. And honestly, I kind of dismissed it at first, thinking corporate speak, this is like what sometimes CEOs will tell you, some, elevated idea and thinking. And I didn't kind of buy it. But, but it was a hypothesis. And I was on sabbatical, COVID happened, and it was a great time for me to kind of think about something different. Now, full disclosure, I had something else going on the side. I was interacting quite a lot with Larry Fink at BlackRock. And Larry was sharing his letters to public company CEOs with me. And I was trying to make sense of why would he care about companies having a purpose? Why would an investor care about this topic? So, in my mind, there's confusion, because the textbook version was, you think about business saying there's the what and the how of business, and the why is like a random thought, right? So I said, okay, I'm going to explore this topic. Now, my instincts would have been to do what I think Claudine has done, which is I'm an empirical researcher. So I said, okay, I'm going to index company purpose, and I'm going to regress it against, performance. I'm going to look at the antecedents of purpose and the consequences of purpose. But I wasn't as creative a thinker as Claudine in terms of how would I gave up on measuring purpose. And I was like, I can't measure it. And I didn't quite think about correlates of purpose and things that might be correlated with purpose and think of that. So I just, honestly, I didn't have the creative thinking on that front. So I said, I'm going to do what my former colleague at Kellogg wrote a great article called Clean Models and Dirty Hands. And that we can build clean models, but if you really want to understand a phenomenon, you got to go and get your hands dirty. So I had to go inside organizations. I did about 300 odd interviews for this book across 18 companies. And after I finished the book, I then did a podcast series of 25 CEOs from around the world, from every continent, from Africa, Latin America, the United States, Middle East, and asked them about their purpose journey. So my whole idea was to uncover how actually leaders experience purpose within their organizations, how they use it, do they use it, Is it simply just an artifact, or is it something more than that? If it's something more than that, how would they put it to work? So, and what are the challenges of doing it? And not every employee buys into it, as Claudine and others have talked about right now. So I want to just clarify a few things with you. I want to first clarify what is purpose. I'm going to just logically take it apart, if we may. Why does it matter? And how do you do it? Right? And the bulk of my research and the book was about how. The what and why was only because there's so much purpose confusion around us. So let me start with what is purpose. The first thing I learned was purpose has been hijacked. It's been hijacked by the left wing and by the right wing. The left wing says purpose equals pro-social purpose. Purpose is anything but profit, right? And the right wing says purpose is only profit. And then we go into these back and forth, and going, we end up nowhere. So even the word is loaded. This guy Ramaswamy calls it woke capitalism. And in fact, even Larry himself has backed off from purpose now and doesn't talk about it that much anymore, because it suddenly became kind of this thing that people label. And I think it's, being from India, if I may invoke I never try to use my Indian ethnicity to my advantage, but if I may here, there's a very ancient word. People think of karma as the Indian thing, karma. There's another word called dharma. And if you try, it doesn't translate well from Sanskrit to English, but it's really about a sense of individual purpose. Like, why am I here on this planet? My sense of purpose is kind of a central construct. Now, can this apply to organizations? First of all, I think it's important to understand that we may say, oh, purpose is anything but profit. In fact, Larry's big mistake, I think, was he called, in his letter, he says purpose and profit, which by a logical inference means purpose is separate from profit. But Peter Drucker said this a long time ago, a business can't say my purpose is anything but profit. Profit is like a bad thing, and I only do other things. That is my purpose. No, businesses have to make profit as well. Peter Drucker told us that a long time ago. So we've kind of gotten stuck on this idea that purpose equals non-profit. I mean, I think of Indra Nooyi, who said performance with purpose. She didn't say performance and purpose. She said performance with purpose. So I think we've also gotten confused about kind of the purpose as a construct, right? And what it is. And then the other thing is we get into this kind of mission statements. So after my inspiring call with Satya, I went back and I read their purpose statements. And I found this. And I was again confused. So I requested another follow-up call with Satya, and I had another chat with him, and I said, like, Satya, I'm a little not sure, like, how can this be like the unlock? And he said, Ranjay, you're confused. Purpose is not a purpose statement, right? It's something much bigger than that. What you're missing here is that purpose is, what you don't know is the 9 months we spent debating our purpose, right? And you don't know how we use it. And you have I saw that Flore had cited the excellent article by George John and others, and Sarah Kaplan and others, where they kind of talk about purpose as about goals and duties and responsibilities. So having goals is fine, right? So it's okay to have financial and non-financial goals. What is your larger, why are you here in this world? And being a viable, thriving business is part of our goals. It just forces us, the difference I discovered, and this goes to Larry Fink, was purpose forces us to think long-term about our future. That's the reason why investors even ask that question, like this forcing a long-term horizon, like think about don't only be quarterly driven, think about a long-term horizon. And when you think long-term, it forces you to think about multiple stakeholders. But we logically make that leap saying purpose equals stakeholder management. Purpose is a long-term view about why are you here on this planet. And when you think long-term, you have to think about customers, communities, and other stakeholders as well. So, but we make this logical leap. So purpose is, I'm just going to jump ahead in the interest of time. So the idea was that we're even confused what purpose is. We say purpose is non-profit, purpose is stakeholder, purpose is, and we are unable to integrate this larger idea construct of our purposes and intention about what our place in this world is, right? Now the question is, does it matter? And I applaud Claudine and others who are in Flore and others who are trying to empirically and logically try to connect purpose with performance. Because absent evidence on this front, it's like, okay, this is just an indulgence. The challenge, of course, is how do you measure it? And then can you actually credibly then make that claim? So I had only interviews. So I was asking each of them, like, what are you doing? Like, is this good for business? Right? How does it help you thrive as a business? I asked Satya again, like, how does purpose help you unlock strategy and implementation? And so I was in circles. Then what I'm going to show you took me a year, all in the middle of COVID, talking to all these people, trying to parse out what did I learn. I had many quotes from people. This one said, I pity those things about becoming a sense of performance. If you look at even Larry's own letter, first letter, he says, purpose unifies management, it drives ethical behavior, it guides culture, sustains long-term financial returns. So everyone's doing a song and dance around these things. I had to, as I was writing this book, I had to organize it in my head. And I discovered, first of all, purpose benefits only ensue to a company when it goes deep with purpose. My publisher had told me to write a one-word title of my book because one-word titles sell more copies. I couldn't. I couldn't call it purpose. I had to call it deep purpose because these benefits only ensue when you go deep with purpose. I had a whole chapter in my book on shallow purpose, superficial purpose, because I saw so many variations of the superficial purpose. If you're going to get that employee engagement and meaningfulness, you got to go deep. So here's what I found, but there are three things that I discovered companies do. The first one is purpose is a great directional alignment tool, right? In a turbulent, crazy changing world, Lego was a company I looked at. And at Lego, Jorn Vignustrup, who transformed Lego, said, look, we had to go back to our purpose. First of all, figure out what it was. And then it was a way to prune out of businesses we shouldn't be in. We shouldn't be doing theme parks. We shouldn't be doing video games. We shouldn't be doing movies, right? So it creates directional clarity, but it also creates alignment in the organization. So this is the first chunk of I understood that purpose creates clarity. The second one was what I think Claudine has talked about, and Flore, also you talked about. And all three, I think all three of you, Alan, you also talked a lot about this one as well. That purpose is motivational. It inspires people, right? And we know that inspired workers are far more productive than even satisfied or engaged workers. So purpose elevates people, our own aspiration for who we are. And so you get that. And the third one, on which I've just finished an article in Strategy Science with my former doctoral student, Franz Wolgesogen, where we found that purpose in organizations elicits trust. Other organizations perceive you as more trustworthy because you stand for something. You stand for a set of principles. To your point, Flore, earlier about how stakeholders see you when you have a purpose, right? And this could be anybody. So I discovered that if I was to logically or empirically, in my case, using qualitative to unpack it, there were these three benefits of purpose. And by the way, directionally also, to the point about stakeholder, I discovered that, yes, I love stakeholder theory and it inspired me deeply, but it implies that we can do a win-win. Yes, you can do good and do well. But yes, you hope for that, but most of life is about trade-offs. Most of life is about trade-offs, and we are trading off across different people, across different time horizons. And purpose became an orienting framework to think about those trade-offs in an intelligent kind of a way. Then I discovered that this motivational piece that I told you. By the way, I also looked at sports coaches as well. So Pete Carroll was another one I looked at, was how he tries to engage his employees around a purpose, right? So anyway, so that was the directional, motivational, and relational. The last one, which I'm going to just touch on, as I know we're out of time, is this idea around how do you do it. This is like 6 of my 8 chapters. So this was a long infomercial to request all of you to read my book. That's the reason I'm doing this kind of, and the how is hard. Even coming up with a purpose. I found how companies re-engage with their past to connect into the future, right? And there's some outstanding work coming out of Copenhagen Business School and others where you've looked at kind of how they have done a number of interesting pieces of work around how organizations engage, connect with their past. And what I call like the Sankofa, is a mythological Ghanaian bird called the Sankofa bird that flies forward while looking backwards, right? I also looked at not just kind of the discovery phase of purpose or the articulation phase, it was also the activation phase and the embedding phase. This is the messiness of purpose, right? How do organizations do this? As Satya said, writing it is easy. What comes next is much harder, right? And then how do you tell it as a story? Indra Nui talking about it in very personal terms, what I call moral potency, right? Or then how do you bake it into the architecture? I have a whole chapter on how do organizations connect purpose into their culture and people systems and structure and processes. How they create collaboration and autonomy in the organization, because purpose allows you to loosen the architecture, what you wouldn't in class congruence theory terms. And in this context, how do you make purpose personal for the employees? And how leaders have to be both, using Jim March, both, logic and magic, poets and farmers. So in the end, I've talked about three things you can, if you want. And my learning was we're confused about what is purpose. We're not exactly sure if does purpose good for business or not, and how do you do it? I'll end with something from India, since I am from India originally. This is a very old idea. And this is a quote from something somebody said about 1000 BC. This is 3,000 years ago. They said, you are what your deepest desire is. As your desire is, so is your intention. As your intention is, so is your will. And as your will is, so is your deed. And as your deed is, so is your destiny. So purpose is a very old idea. And to me, it was amazing that I had never studied it. It was a really incredible project for me to kind of learn what an amazing unlock it can be for organizational growth, profitable growth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ranjay, for a wonderful and very inspiring contribution here too. I think bringing together a number of the thoughts and ideas that were also underpinning the previous presentations and keynotes. So I think that's a wonderful contribution to round off with, and opening up lots of questions. Happy to open up the floor. I saw some great questions and thoughts also appearing in the chat box. I'd love to open up to any thoughts or questions from our participants here too. So please welcome any thoughts or questions that you may want to pick up on by the panelists too in the chat box.
I want to just react to Louis Moore, who said that Matchkin Schultz. Absolutely, that's what I was referring to when I said Copenhagen. She's done amazing work, really fascinating work on that topic.
Great.
Maybe the
wonderful.
panelists have reactions to each other. Otherwise, I definitely have a question. Thank you for some great presentations. Really interesting stuff.
The only reaction I had is just to be so appreciative of this panel and how you constructed it, because it's such a complicated topic that benefits from different perspectives. So we've had the sort of philosophical perspective, the sort of stakeholder perspective, Ranjay's deep interviewing and sort of the dirty hands perspective, the high level, large sample perspective, and so many of the findings reinforce each other. And so I love the balance of perspectives, and I love listening to the other panelists on this.
Thank you, Claudine. Thank you. I totally concur. I appreciate it. Louise, you'd like to jump in on one of the questions? I have some thoughts on that later too.
I have. I really enjoyed all the presentations. So one thing that sort of came up in several of the presentations have to do with this idea of clarity that you also talked very nicely about, Claudine. And one of the things I often speak to my exec ed students about when they talk about purpose is, many students come in and they say, I actually have no idea what the purpose is in my organization. And I don't know why we are here, and I just come in and I do my job. And so we have some very interesting discussions about whether or not that's important for the organization as a whole, but also for them as employees. And of course, as you talked about, there's something motivational, and I like, Ranjay, that you are adding the reputation and the relational to this. But the question I had to all of you is to what extent is it important that purpose is also, so Ranjay, you said, well, it's not a statement, right? It doesn't have to be a statement. So is your conclusion that it's not important that organizations have a clear statement of purpose? It's more about that they've communicated something about direction, or what's the conclusion on this, or what's your view on this question?
Here's the thing is, I think, and maybe others can jump in as well, I think is that the point I was making was that you can't infer purpose from a purpose statement. Every company has a mission statement. So it's really hard to infer, oh yeah, they have a mission statement, so they must have a mission. I mean, if you look at, Theranos had a purpose statement. Enron had a purpose statement. Purdue Pharmaceutical had a purpose statement. And so all these companies kind of parade it, and in fact has made the cynics buy into this purpose washing story. So the question then is, how do you infer it? And that is really, really hard. Now, I like Claudine's approaches where you back your way in by saying, are employees feeling meaning at work? And that's one way to get at it. So you look for correlates of purpose and say, well, you can't measure purpose directly, but maybe we can get at it from other ways. But I still think that's a project that needs to be done, because I think if we're going to bring this topic mainstream, my idea of bringing it mainstream was everyone, when I saw purpose books, they all talked about Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, Unilever, Whole Foods. And we went around the same 5 examples of kind of funky founders who had kind of really progressive views of the world. So it becomes kind of a fringe topic. To me, what's interesting is in the business world, it's gone mainstream, and the question is, for us to really kind of now, we need to kind of catch up with the phenomenon and how it's put to use and purpose in action. That I think is the learning for me. And that's what Satya was saying, that, don't get hung up on the words. It's what we do with the words. And that's why I was confused by the words too. And I think that's something for us to think about.
Yeah, I would wholeheartely agree with that. It's funny. It's the purpose. So I teach strategy implementation to MBAs, and it's this really interesting case of convergent evolution, because the session that I teach on purpose has always been about Microsoft, and it's been deliberately to get away from the Patagonias and the Ben & Jerry's, because once you hear that, to Ranjay's point of sort of having a political valence on it or a normative valence on it, it doesn't have to be. And the fact that it's so core to this $3.5 trillion market cap company, I think speaks to the centrality of the idea. The only thing that I would add on what he just said, which is excellent, is I think there's an interesting trend that overlays with this, which is that when you look at this plot of intangible assets over time of companies, and I think probably many of us are familiar with this plot, right? And when you looked at companies' balance sheets in the 1970s, they were something like 20% intangible assets. The rest were tangible assets, right? Plant, inventory, PP&E, tradable goods. And it's completely inverted now, where the basis, the profit channels for the economy that we're in right now is all in intangibles. And fundamentally, those intangibles are people that walk out the door. And so the fact that purpose has taken off recently, I don't think is just a fad, or it's not sort of an independent trend from that. It's the fact that we've turned to an economy that fundamentally relies on people and ingenuity and creativity and innovativeness, and purpose plays a central role there. And when I think about clarity and all of that, which is to your original question, Louise, people, the research from psychology is very clear on this, which is that, in fact, there's a gentleman in my department, Drew Carton, who has this wonderful phrase. He's in the OB group, so he's studied this more from a micro perspective of what he calls the purpose paradox, where he says, the more high and mighty and sort of vague and big your purpose is, the more it alienates the employees inside the company. Because when you go into work every day, and if your job is customer service, or your job is bench science, or your job is marketing, and you can't connect what you do on a daily basis to this, high and mighty purpose that your CEO is talking about in Davos or, wherever, then it makes you feel like he or she is a hypocrite, and it makes you feel like your job is meaningless. And so it matters when you can actually connect what you do and you see that your work is directly connected to that, that's where it's the most effective. And so that's where purpose really plays in. And the fact that it's inside the organization in these sort of intangible economies where creativity is king and innovativeness is king, that's why I think purpose and this role of clarity has become more important these days or more central to the conversation these days than perhaps in sort of in different types of contexts.
Wonderful sets of thoughts here on this question from Luis. Thank you very much for reflecting on that. We have room for one or two more questions to allow for time. Is there any questions from the participants? If not, I'm happy to to share some of the ideas that floated in my mind, but clearly don't want to take up the space here. So.
Yeah, I don't want to take time away from you.
Please, Mario. Please.
This is just a quick question here, because this is something that's been on my mind for a while. I'm at the University of Illinois, and Willie Ocasio here set up this initiative, ISOI, the Illinois Strategic Organizations Initiative, and we have these monthly meetings. There's a couple of different sort of task forces. One of them is about organizational intelligence and purpose. And I am still trying to wrap my head around all that. But, Matt Kratz is, it seems, completely focused on organizational purpose or corporate purpose. And we have been trying to, knowing Willie Ocasio with the whole, the Carnegie School, trying to link March's concept of organizational intelligence to organizational purpose. Maybe it's completely clear in their minds. It's not in mine. I don't know if any of the panelists here have any thoughts on this. Does it fit? And I apologize, I had to come in late, so maybe you talked about this already, but does this fit in the Carnegie School or not? Is it related to sort of this elusive concept of organizational intelligence at all? Any ideas on that? Otherwise, I'll just, no worries if no one has any answers to that. Take that as a no.
Well, I'll take a shot at it. Let me take a shot at it. I think it's,
Ranjay.
look, I think what ends up happening is sometimes we as org theorists, we want to bring in sophisticated constructs, and sometimes they simplify and clarify, sometimes they can confuse and complicate. I think it's an interesting idea of connecting intelligence to purpose. Honestly, in my naive off-the-cuff thinking is purpose is bigger than intelligence. Purpose is a meta construct around kind of understanding your place in the world and having a point of view about your long-term view of the world, right? Intelligence is more connected to learning, adaptability, sense and respond, sense making, and being able to pull that out. Now, you would say purpose can inform your intelligence, that, maybe makes you more intelligent, or however you want to think about it. So one could look at kind of causal arguments around that idea. And maybe a theorist could try to unpack that, because it's not an empirical question you can easily try to unpack. But maybe there is a conceptual conversation around kind of like how, and this is part of, I think, what we should be thinking about, is that not only clarifying what is purpose, but how purpose can be an enabler back to purposeful growth. How can purpose be an enabler for building thriving organizations? If purpose fosters intelligence, purpose fosters innovation, purpose fosters responsible growth, purpose fosters the ability to tackle multiple stakeholders, purpose fosters motivated employees, and through that unlocks value. So if we can understand kind of the benefits of purpose through a variety of ways, I think it's a great endeavor for us to be on.
Thank you, Ranjay. Thank you for connecting that. And, very interesting question also to link it back to theory, right? I mean, we talk about stakeholder theory, and, I think there's other theories that could inform or be related to to the notion of purpose, including how firms learn to maybe adapt and connect to stakeholders, and I mean, I guess there's lots of different perspectives we can connect. In order to respect the timing of our STR virtual symposium, I would like to take the opportunity here to thank our speakers, Alan, Claudine, Flore, and Ranjay for an amazing set of thoughts. Thank you, for sharing, and connecting also. Indeed, like Claudine was underlining, from coming in from different perspectives. I've greatly appreciated that. Thank you very much for making and joining our symposium here. Thank you also, Louise, to making this happen too, and to our participants for joining in. I'm hoping that there's lots of research also coming in on the very topic, and as this goes mainstream, as Ranjay has been proposing, and looking forward to connecting at future events too.
Thank you, Koen, for organizing. And I really agree with Claudine's comment. This was a really great conversation on a very focused topic. I think we've created a session that can be used actually in teaching and in other ways. So thank you so much for great introductions to this topic and for putting it together, Koen. That was great.
Thank you again, Koen, and thank you for inviting us, and thank you, participants. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you. Yeah.